The crowd are on their feet. Eala barely has the energy to get to the net to congratulate her opponent on a classic.
So we've just seen Chen and Eala dominate the number 2 seeds, and half of the winning team in the Australian Open, Zhang, who was actually in the team with Buksha, did win the Australian Open a couple weeks ago. So massive win for them and massive win for Southeast Asian tennis.
Novak Djokovic just said something about Alex Eala that made everyone in the tennis world stop and pay attention. The greatest player of all time doesn't hand out compliments casually. So when he called her a superstar during a press conference, that wasn't just nice words. That was a stamp of approval that could change the entire trajectory of her career. Let's break down what Djokovic actually said and why it matters way more than you think. Before we get into what Djokovic said, drop a comment and tell me, had you even heard of Alex Eala before this whole thing blew up, or are you just finding out about her now because of the chaos? Alright, so here's what happened. Novak Djokovic was doing a routine press conference at the Australian Open, and a reporter asked him about the evolution of the tournament over the 20-plus years he's been coming to Melbourne. Pretty standard question. They wanted to know what he thought about the massive crowds, the corporate sponsorships, and complaints that the event has gotten too commercial and overcrowded.
I saw the other day with Alex Eala, that's been a talk, and which is understandable. There's some players coming from respective countries, like she's coming from Philippines, which is now a big deal. She's been the biggest ever, tennis player from that country, which is a big country, and there's a big interest. So things like that happen. I mean, it's you could argue that it was, maybe a poor schedule, and maybe they could schedule him on a bigger court. Yes, but again, she's so young and she's just coming through. So and obviously the first couple rounds, the schedule is so packed. The big courts with big names, it's difficult. It's not easy to manage that, but. Again, it's a good problem to have, to be honest. Let's just imagine if there's a lack of people coming, or that stands are empty. That's a bigger problem.
Most players would give some bland answer about how it's great to see tennis growing or whatever. But Djokovic took it in a completely different direction. He said that complaining about overflowing crowds is a luxury problem, and that every tournament organizer dreams of selling out tickets and breaking attendance records. Then he threw in this line. There are far worse nightmares for a tournament to face than having too many fans. That's classic Djokovic. The man has been around long enough to remember when the Australian Open was borrowing space from a local football club just so players had somewhere to warm up. He specifically mentioned using a gym across the street that belonged to some Aussie rules team. He messed up the name at first, said Essendon, then corrected himself to Collingwood, and apologised to fans because apparently that rivalry is serious business in Australia. The point he was making is that the Australian Open has transformed from a tournament that was scraping by with borrowed facilities to a massive global event with indoor arenas, recovery centres, and 5-star everything. That evolution isn't a betrayal of what tennis used to be. It's proof that the sport is winning and attracting more attention than ever before. But then Djokovic pivoted to Alex Eala, and this is where things got really interesting. He brought up what happened with her match being scheduled on a tiny outer court and how thousands of people showed up trying to get in. He said it's been the talk of the locker room, and rightfully so. Security barriers were getting pushed to the limit. The logistics completely collapsed. It was chaos. Now here's the key part. Djokovic didn't frame this as a disaster or a failure by the tournament organizers. He framed it as evidence of something bigger happening in tennis. He acknowledged that they probably should have anticipated the response and put her on a bigger court. But the real story is why so many people showed up in the first place. Alex Eala represents an entire nation. The Philippines has over 110 million people, and they've never had a tennis player capture global attention like this before. When Djokovic calls her a superstar, that's not some throwaway compliment. That's the greatest player in tennis history recognizing that Alex Eala has transcended being just another promising young player. She's become a cultural phenomenon. The weight she's carrying isn't just about her ranking or her results. It's about representing an entire country that sees her as their ambassador on the world's biggest stages. This is where the sarcasm kicks in, because let's be real here. The Australian Open organizers absolutely dropped the ball on this one. They scheduled a player who has the backing of 110 million people on a court that holds maybe a few hundred spectators. What did they think was going to happen? That everyone would politely watch on their phones and not try to actually see her play in person. The fact that this became such a massive issue shows how out of touch tournament organizers can be with the changing demographics of tennis fandom. They are still operating under the assumption that the only players who draw massive crowds are the established Western stars. But the sport is globalizing faster than the infrastructure can keep up with, and Alex Eala is proof of that. Djokovic made this point really well when he talked about finding the sweet spot between managing crowds and maintaining the experience. He saw what happened with Eala and recognized it as a preview of what's coming. Fresh territories, ravenous fan bases, and absolute chaos when those fan bases show up. The old model of scheduling and court assignments doesn't account for the kind of cultural phenomenon that Eala represents. What's wild is that Eala's rise to this level of fame happened almost instantly. Normally, tennis likes to slow cook its stars. You grind on the tour for years, slowly move up the rankings, and gradually build a following. But with Eala, it's been like flipping a switch. One moment she's a promising junior player, the next she's got an entire nation tracking her every move and showing up in masses to watch her play. This creates a really interesting dynamic because the sports infrastructure wasn't built for this kind of sudden global celebrity. Court bookings, TV slots, media obligations, all of that is still designed around the traditional path to stardom. When someone jumps the line because of cultural and national significance rather than ranking points, it causes friction and confusion. That's why Djokovic's comments matter so much. He's been through this himself. He knows what it's like to carry the hopes of an entire country. Serbia isn't the Philippines in terms of population, but the pressure and expectations are similar. When he talks about celebrity being a golden prison, he's speaking from experience. The same wave of adoration that lifts you up can drown you if you're not prepared for it. For a teenager like Eala, who's still learning how to compete at the professional level, that pressure is enormous. She's not just trying to win matches and improve her ranking. She's managing the expectations of millions of people who see her success as their own. That's a completely different level of mental burden than what most young players deal with. The mob scene at her match wasn't just random fans being excited. Those were true believers who crossed oceans and fought through crowds desperate to see their icon in person. They weren't there for the tennis necessarily. They were there for what she represents. That transforms a standard early-round match into a spectacle that outshines whatever's happening on the main courts. Djokovic recognized this, and instead of criticizing the chaos, he celebrated it. He said these frenzies are inevitable when the sport outgrows its infrastructure. The first week of a Grand Slam is always chaotic with tight schedules and competing storylines, but the rise of players like Eala shows how complex the puzzle has become. Fan engagement isn't just about rankings and trophies anymore. It's about cultural weight and national pride. When the greatest player in history publicly backs a young player like this, it does two things. First, it legitimizes all the hype around her. People can dismiss fan excitement as irrational nationalism or whatever, but when Djokovic calls you a superstar, that's validation from someone who knows exactly what it takes to operate at the highest level. Second, it protects her from some of the criticism and scrutiny that comes with this kind of sudden fame. There are always going to be people who say the attention is undeserved or premature, that she hasn't won enough to justify the hype. But Djokovic's endorsement shuts that down. He's essentially saying the hype is real and the tennis world better adjust to this new reality because it's not going away. The comparison between the modern Australian Open and what it was like when Djokovic started playing there is actually pretty stunning. He talked about using borrowed gyms and sharing ice baths with football players. Now the tournament has state-of-the-art everything. That transformation happened because tennis invested in itself and grew its global footprint. But with that growth comes new challenges, like how to handle situations where a player's cultural significance outweighs their seating or ranking. Djokovic's broader point about preferring overcrowded stadiums to empty ones is something tournament organizers need to tattoo on their foreheads. The worst thing that can happen to a sport is apathy. If people don't care enough to show up, you're dead in the water. The fact that thousands of people are fighting to get into a side court to watch a young player from the Philippines is exactly the kind of problem you want to have. It means tennis is breaking into new markets and capturing the imagination of people who never cared about the sport before. That's how you build long-term growth and sustainability. Yeah, it creates logistical headaches in the short term, but those are good problems to solve. You can figure out how to build bigger venues, improve crowd management, and adjust scheduling. What you can't fix is a lack of interest. The elephant in the room is whether the tennis establishment is actually prepared to handle this new era. The sport has been dominated by players from a relatively small group of countries for decades. Now you've got rising stars from places like the Philippines who bring massive fan bases that don't fit the traditional model. Are tournaments going to adapt their thinking, or are they going to keep scheduling these players on outer courts and acting surprised when chaos ensues? Eala's situation is a test case for how tennis handles globalization. If the sport can successfully integrate these new markets and fan bases without alienating traditional audiences, that's a huge win. But if the establishment treats these players as novelties or disruptions rather than the future of the sport, that's a missed opportunity that could come back to haunt them. Djokovic clearly sees Eala as part of tennis's future, not some flash in the pan. His comments weren't patronizing or dismissive. He treated her like a peer who just happens to be at an earlier stage of her career. That's significant coming from someone who's won more Grand Slams than anyone else and has earned the right to gatekeep if he wanted to. The fact that he chose to elevate her instead shows he understands where the sport is headed. Tennis can't survive on the same old European and American stars forever. It needs fresh faces from diverse backgrounds who can capture new audiences and keep the sport relevant globally. Eala fits that profile perfectly, which is why her success or failure matters beyond just her individual career. What happens next is going to be fascinating to watch. Can Eala handle the pressure and develop into the player everyone hopes she can be? Will tournaments learn from the Australian Open chaos and adjust how they schedule and promote players with massive cultural followings? Can the tennis establishment embrace this new era of global stars, or will they cling to outdated models that don't reflect the sport's changing demographics? Djokovic's praise gives Eala credibility and protection as she navigates all of this. When criticism comes, and it will come because it always does with young hyped players, she can point to the fact that Novak Djokovic called her a superstar and recognized what she represents. That's armor against the doubters and haters who want to tear down anyone getting attention they think is undeserved. The broader conversation about the Australian Open getting too commercial and corporate is interesting but kind of beside the point. Every major sporting event has gone through this evolution. Money and sponsorships fund the prize pools and facilities that make the sport attractive to top players. You can't have world-class tennis without world-class investment, and that investment comes with strings attached. What matters more is whether the sport maintains its soul and competitive integrity while chasing growth. So far, tennis has done a decent job of that compared to other sports. The on-court product is still compelling, the rivalries are real, and the best players generally win regardless of their marketing value. As long as that continues, the commercial stuff is just background noise. So there you have it. Novak Djokovic didn't just compliment Alex Eala. He basically anointed her as the future of tennis and called out the establishment for not being ready. The chaos at her match wasn't a bug. It was a feature showing the sport is growing in ways nobody anticipated. If you think tennis is about to get way more interesting with players like Eala breaking through, smash that like button and subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments about whether she can live up to the hype.